am truly delighted to be here with all of you this evening. And as I was thinking about this talk, I realized that this is truly coming full circle at CIIS. Because this whole project started when I was a beginning student just trying to figure out what I was going to do with my dissertation. And now here we are with the book. So it is quite an honor, very much so. Now, I wanted to just let you know that the way I've arranged the talk tonight is in two parts. And the first part is a brief overview of how this book came to be and what were the threads that all connected it. And then we'll talk more specifically about Indigenous knowing and how that relates to contemporary leadership. So let's start really just with, oh, you do have to turn it on. There we go. Okay. So the whole project began as a way of trying to understand what to do with my dissertation. And then the book became the outgrowth of that. So what I was wanting to do in the dissertation was I was wanting to look at leadership, a different kind of leadership, a way of understanding how we might be able to actually heal the planet, how we might be able to do something other than what industrial societies have been doing and are still doing. So I had come across a name, the Sami People, and I knew nothing about them except that they were talked about as a heart-centered and nature-oriented society. And I thought, well, if we're going to learn something, it's not going to come from mainstream leaders and mainstream organizations in the US and in the industrialized world. It's going to come from someone like that. So I began to do a bit of research on them and discovered that where they are is way up here. So I thought I would start with a map of Europe just to show you exactly how far up that actually is. So I want to give you a little bit of a better map of Sami land. And what you see here is that all of these, that there's really 4 countries that are now have partitioned Sami land. And so Sami land is part of northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and also the Kola Peninsula of Russia. And so where I spent my time was here, in Tromsø, Alta, Kautokeino, Tanu, actually the most northern regions of the planet. I mean, beyond this sea is the polar ice cap. And so it was quite the thing to do. Now, I wanted to show, so my official purpose in all of this was to interview contemporary Sami leaders. And I really wanted to interview, real people in real time, in modern life, but from an Indigenous perspective. And I particularly wanted to interview people who had something to do with work that involved nature. What I didn't know is that would involve almost everybody in Somaliland. But that was good. I had many choices for who to interview. Now, but I also had another reason for doing this, besides just research. When I began to understand that I might really do this, that I might actually go to the Arctic and begin to find out about a culture that seemed so far away and so different from my own, I realized that if I could do that, if I could find a different way of leadership, it might change me as well. And that was part of the whole journey. And so I also had an ulterior motive. And the ulterior motive was that I had strongly suspected for a long time that I had ancestry in that culture. And, but I had no proof. What I had been told by my mother was that my great-grandmother, Caroline Hansen, was from the north of Norway. And what that means in real terms is that if you are from the north, probably you are Sami. And I had a cousin who sent me a picture, this picture, And I saw how much she looked like all the other women that I had seen in Sami land. But that's all I knew. Now, what was actually, what some people have said to me or asked me, they said, so what's the big deal? So yeah, maybe you have ancestry in the Sami, or maybe not. And so why do you care? Well, the reason that I cared was because this entire journey actually started in 1996 with a dream that I had in Kimmy Johnson's Ancestral Consciousness class. Mm-hmm. And if those of you who have taken her class, how many of you? Yes? Okay, a few. You know that what she does is she always starts her class with a drumming journey. And she asks everyone in the class to make sure to ask their ancestors to come and be with them for the class. So, okay, she started the drumming journey, and I said my prayer and asked my ancestors to be with me. And then I was no longer in the classroom. What happened was that I was somewhere else. And I found myself seated before a fire in a dark enclosed space, surrounded by about 7 ancestors who I knew to be my ancestors. And there were a mix. There were some Caucasian, blonde-looking people, some with more Asian, dark features. And they all said to me in unison, "You don't know who you are. You must find out who you are." And they actually repeated it 3 times, just in case I didn't get it. And then the next thing I heard was Kimmy Johnson's drum bringing us back to the classroom. And I must say that I just didn't know what to think. I was absolutely in shock. But it was true. I didn't know who I was. I mean, I was an American. Aren't we all Americans? And yet I realized that this was something special. There was some way in which I needed to pay attention here. And that was the beginning of what is actually still continuing to this day. It was absolutely a sea change for me. And I'm beginning to understand now why they told me what they told me. So when I actually began to understand that I was doing this, I was really going to do this, I decided that I wanted to be able to do it in a way that wasn't the way I might ordinarily take a trip, which was go on the internet and arrange everything and have an itinerary and have an agenda and know exactly where I'm going to be on this date and that date, some other date. Because I realized that this was a different kind of journey. And it was one that had to take place on a more intuitive level, from a more spontaneous, present-oriented place. And so I decided that I was going to take this journey by simply allowing whatever wanted to present itself, and not to make forward plans. The only plans I did make, actually, were to book a round-trip ticket, which Michael was very happy to hear, my husband, and finally, out of sheer desperation, to book my first lodging in Oslo, which actually turned out to be a mistake. But so the rest of it, I would simply allow my intuition, my dreams, synchronicities to guide me. Now that seemed like a great plan at first, but as the journey came closer and closer and closer, panic began to set in. And it became all that I could do to not plan things. I would wake up every morning and I would think, oh my God, I should have this and I should get that, and I really should have my interviews lined up, and I don't even know where I'm going, and oh my God. And so I actually, I really almost went into apoplexy about this until I finally understood something. And what that was is that it was fear. That somehow or other, everything about this was operating from fear. And as if somehow, if I didn't plan every single moment of my experience, some great disaster might happen. But then, and when I really came to that place, I also understood that this wasn't just about the journey, that this was about my life. And that was how I was living my life without ever allowing for anything to spontaneously arise, unless it just barged in, that I was really trying to control every aspect of my life. And I understand that that was personal programming, but I also began to see that it's cultural programming, that that's how people do things. Well, what do you mean you're going to, you're going 12,000 miles away and you don't even know where you're going? My God. And so I began to see that I was also a product of a culture that didn't like spontaneity and didn't want to allow for the mystery of life. So I finally, so it became, sort of a greater and greater battle. And then I finally received, on the morning that I left, a message that I realized was going to be the message that would enable me to do it. And the message was this. It was actually dream instructions that just rose in my mind when I awoke on the morning that I was actually going to get on the plane. And it just said, speak to everyone and come from love. And so when I understood that became the key that changed everything about it. And I could feel that if I could simply open my heart, then I could actually talk to people and things would happen as they needed to happen. And so they did. And in the process of speaking to everyone and coming from love, I actually had ended up with more interviews than I could ever have processed for my dissertation. I did do 23 official interviews. And then in the process of all of that, I met these three people. Now, Elina Helena-Renvall, senior research scientist, was at the University of Lapland. It was a totally random event as how I got to meet her. It was actually an intuitive sense that I should call her at 11:30 at night. And and there was a 9-hour time difference. So this was right before I left, and she happened to be in her office. And it was 8:30 in the morning. And without that, I don't know that I would have met her. But she turned out to be the person that not only steered my research and gave me all the information about who to talk to and where to go, but she also became my advocate for the ancestral part of it. And with her vast knowledge of Sami culture, Sami identities, and different places where Sami are, from what I had simply told her about my first dream, she said, well, I think you might be Sea Sami, and why don't you go to these islands? And it turned out that she was right, that that's exactly where my family was from. About halfway through the trip, I also met this guy. He's a truly larger-than-life figure. It was a very random event how I met him. I was talking to someone else in a dining lavabo, and just simply asked if there were any Noides I might be able to talk to. I kind of got the fisheye from this person, but then she said, yes. And she gave me his name and his phone number. And he was able to do a reading for me that actually was about Caroline's personal life. Who was this woman who was my great-grandmother? What was her story? And also, what was my connection to her story? Why was I being called to this place? And finally, through Elina, I met Johan Burles. He's not Sami, he is a Norwegian, he's married to Sami. But and he's quite a celebrated figure. He has a database of Sami families living in the same islands that I ultimately found out my ancestry was part of, dating back from the 1600s. And so it was he who actually finally confirmed that indeed I do have Sami ancestry, and indeed Caroline was a Sami person. So it's all of those threads. It was the personal threads, the academic threads, this relational aspect of the journey itself, and all the intuitions and intuitive guidance that I got along the way that actually is long roots. So I simply wanted you to know what the back story is for this talk tonight. So if anybody wants to say anything, this would be a good time, or not. I will go on. Going once? Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, are those wolves, the figurines?
They probably are. They might be wolverines. I mean, where this all came from, there are several different sites that are petroglyph sites. I was in one of them in Alta. I don't think this came from Alta, but Alta itself is a bay, it's a fjord, and they have these flat white rocks that line the bay, and so I think they said it's a total of 1.5 miles of this rock outcroppings. And so for eons, I think the first of these were done around 6,000 BC, and then the last of them actually around the birth of Christ. And nobody knows exactly why. I've spent a lot of time myself trying to feel into why. But I do know that in this particular petroglyph, this is right here a leader in a boat, and this canopy is always the signifier of the leader. And so clearly it is it's an ocean-going vessel. You can tell by the way that it's constructed. And then these wolverines may or may not be part of that same story, whatever it is, because there were varying carvings that took place all over these rocks. I don't think it's a reindeer. You'll see something that is reindeer, because they have long tails and no horns. But it's always interesting to try to figure out really what they are.
I have one other question.
Yeah.
On the maps that you showed of Sweden at the beginning.
Yeah.
So you had. It seemed like there were sections that had different.
Yes.
Lettering.
Yeah. Thank you. What that really is those are the different. There were 9 different types, Sami tribes, if you will, or cultures, and they each had different language. So each of those blocks indicates where that particular group of Sami were living at the time. And it was interesting that they had they really didn't have common language. And I often thought, I've wondered about that myself, but if you think back, they've been on their lands for 10,000 years. And so there wasn't much travel 10,000 years ago, particularly in harsh climate. So I think each of these cultures grew pretty independently. And of course now they really are trying to revive all of the different languages. And they have a predominant language, South Sami, which is generally what people try to use.
The reason I'm interested is that I was just doing a tracing of my great-grandparents.
Oh.
And I noticed that one of the southern, more
around Trondheim, maybe?
Yeah. That's where it was a forested region in the center of Sweden.
Oh, in Sweden, right.
But that is, that's a map of.
It's a map of the whole Scandinavian
of the whole
peninsula.
Right,
so
yeah.
It's Norway, and Norway is just a thin little
Exactly.
ridge. And then Sweden, which is most of that peninsula,
Right.
and then Finland, and then this jutting part, which was the Kola Peninsula of Russia.
Yeah.
So, and of course at the beginning, it was all theirs, and there was no partitions. And then as modernity, began to show up, about 1830s, all of a sudden, well, that's me, and that's mine, and then they began to partition it.
So I'm sorry to take up so
No.
much time, but can you tell a name, like a Swami name, or I'm not Swami, a Sami name? Sorry. In other words, are there familiar names that are particularly Sami that you might be able to trace?
Family names?
Yes. In other words, I have relatives that go back to the 17th, 16th,
Right.
18th century.
There are names.
So I'm wondering if there are Sami names
Right.
that I might see.
There are. There are names that would be very, very common Sami names. One of the things that happens, though, because that whole culture became intermingled, there was a lot of intermarrying. You begin to find, like my grandmother, Caroline, her married name was Hansen, and she married a Norwegian. But I have her maiden name, and it's a very different name, and I can't even tell you what it is at the moment. But you're right, that is a clue. But even if it isn't that kind of a term,
it might still be.
It might still be, especially if it's your maternal side. Yeah. So, all right. Any more? Yeah. So, Indigenous ways of knowing. And how does all of that impact us as modern leaders today? Well, I think the first thing we have to unpack is the term Indigenous ways of knowing, because truly what that term refers to, it's a term that Westerners use to describe how Indigenous people know what they know. But what it is, it's a sort of an interrelated set of timeless values and principles and practices that show us how we can begin to live in such a way that we can balance, that we live in balance with the earth, and that we live in balance with all other life forms that live on this planet. And of all of those interrelated concepts and values and principles, perhaps the most central to Indigenous ways of knowing is the principle of interconnectedness, what we call the web of life. Now, it may not come as any surprise to anyone in this group, but for a lot of people, the fact that the Sami did not and do not consider that human beings are the pinnacle of life, or that we are the predominant life form on the planet, might come as a shock. But what is actually so is that for Sami, and I think most Indigenous, maybe if not all Indigenous people, the idea of the web of life is that we are all interconnected and we are all embedded in this web, and that human beings comprise one aspect among myriad life forms that are part of and important to the web of life. And if you think about the web of life as the ecological, planetary ecological system, it is the fact that humans, as well as all other life forms, must be sustained in balance so that all can live. And that is the principle by which everything happens in the way that Sami people think. So, and then when we begin to drill down into what interconnectedness actually is, we find the major principle of equality. And this is their Sami creation myth. This is the story of how they became Sami. And they say we have this world in equal share with reindeer, fish, wolf, fox, wolf, and bear, and none holds dominance. So when you think about what that means in practice, it means that we have to share this planet equally with all other forms of life that have territory, that need space, that have needs for food and habitat and all of it. And also by implication, it is about how humans relate to other humans. And that we must share all of this equally. Now, that's one. And then when we also drill into what does it mean to live equally on the planet, we understand that there are three words that show up all the time in Sami talk, Sami reading, Sami literature, and those are the ideas of tolerance, respect, and understanding. So if we live in an interconnected world, then, and if all beings are unique and important, then what is important to us is that we show tolerance for all the uniqueness and all the differentness that the world holds. And that not only do we just show tolerance, but we must also respect who they are and how they live. how they actually do their lives, whether it is a fox or a bear, or whether it's a human being that has of a different ethnicity. That all of those things are about respecting other people's space, other people's rights, other people's privileges. And not only just respecting, but trying to understand them, not from a place of judgment, but from a place of curiosity. So who are all those people, and what are they all about? So this woman I met at the Rita Rita Festival, which is the oldest Indigenous music festival in Swamiland. And I decided I wanted to go there because I thought it would be a good place to meet people. Well, indeed it is. It was. And so I had a small conversation with her because everybody was curious, like, why am I here? And there were 150 countries represented in this festival, and I was the only person from the United States. So I became kind of, I think, a curiosity for a lot of people, which was fine with me because I really wanted to talk to people. So what would always start was this curious conversation of who am I and why did I come? And that was, at the beginning, kind of an interesting question to answer. But finally I said, well, it all started with a dream. And they said, oh, a dream. Okay, well, yeah, we have those all. Yeah, I understand that. I have dreams too. And so when they would begin to listen to the story of how I came to this place, I have never been listened to with such depth, such respect, and such understanding. I must tell you that I had, so many conversations with people, and many times I would end up in tears because they were able to reflect back parts of me that I couldn't even see and I didn't understand about myself. And once you've had that kind of depth in your life, it's very difficult to do without that. I'm finding myself still in withdrawal from that experience. So, so there it is. And then also at the Rita Rita Festival, I met another guy who was kind of a character. His name is Antti Mikko. Now his that was all I ever knew him by was Antti Mikko, but he is in fact, he has a last name that I never knew it. And he was a musician, and I would see him everywhere all the time, and he would be always helping someone. He would always be in the place of, helping people with their equipment, filling in if somebody wasn't available, helping people, get their technical problems settled, or whatever it was, he was there. And I realized that he wasn't part of the staff. He just knew everyone, and everyone trusted him. And so I happened to be sitting next to him in a lavabo one night. You know what a lavabo is? It's a teepee, basically. It looks like a teepee. It's a round, conical place. And there are community lavabos, which are big. They might hold 25 or 30 or 40 people. And then there are individual lavabos. So this whole festival was arranged with lavabos. And so I was talking to him, I just said, Antti Mikko, I'm so impressed with how it is that you have been so instrumental to so many people, and it looks like you've helped so many people, and I just wonder how you've been able to do that and what that's about for you. And he said, oh, well, I'm just being myself. And he said, and people trust me. And so there was something about the way he said it, because he was very unassuming, very modest, but at the same time there was something big in that people trusted him. So I said, can you say a little bit more about trust? What is trust for you? And he said, well, the first thing is, I tell the truth. And I thought, okay. And he says, and you know what, I have to tell the truth first to myself, so that I don't begin to feel like a big shot. Because if I know who I am, then I'm not in any danger of being someone else. I said, wow. And then he said, and you know what else is true? He says, because I don't have to be anyone else, I can really pay attention to other people. I can listen to what they say, and that's a very good thing because you learn a lot from other people. And yeah, that's right. And then he said, and as you saw, it also helps if you don't have any agenda and you're not having to be someone you're not, that you can also be here to help people when they have problems. And so you can talk to them, you can listen, and you can work things out when problems happen. And then finally he said, and I keep my word. If I say I'm going to do something, I will. So then he all of a sudden just switched and he said, so, would you come to my house tomorrow to attend the choir practice? And I didn't know what to say, I didn't know whether that would be a good thing or not a good thing, or how I would deal with it, and finally I just thought, well, I'll just go with it. And I said, well, yeah, I'll go. And then he gave me this really intense fisheye stare. And he said, will you really come? He says, I know that people from the U.S. always say they're going to do things, but they never do, because they don't tell the truth. And that really set me back, because I realized that he was right, and probably I would not have come. I was being polite, and so I was being agreeable, but I didn't know if I was going to come. I didn't even know if I could come. But then I began to think about how many other times in my life have I done that? And other people have done that. And that's sort of how we do things. And how is that? And particularly, how is that about trust? And then I realized that if I really wanted people to be able to trust me, I would have to be able to give them my word in such a way that they realized that they could trust me. And that became one of those moments where I realized it was almost like I wanted to redo my whole life, because I realized that I really wasn't measuring up to what my potential could be. So, and then I began to think about telling the truth in our culture, particularly at the moment, where we have fake news, we have parallel versions of truth, and we have entire websites that have to do fact-checking, my goodness. So what does that say about our ability to say what's so, to tell the truth? And I couldn't help but wonder how it might be different if, in fact, we all did tell the truth. And starting with the truth to ourselves. And that was a big one for me. So this, these are sort of the context by which we think, well, okay, these are great concepts for Indigenous understanding, but maybe they're just nice ideals to shoot for. Well, I would like to say that that's actually not so in the Sami land, and that these same concepts that we've just been talking about are in fact the basis for how people treat other people in all kinds of ways. So I wanted to share with you 3 examples, because we're talking about leadership. We're talking about people who are leaders and who are leaders in action. And so I'd like to introduce you to some people. So the first person I'd like to introduce you to is Willy Olsen. Now, Willy Olsen is he's a 5th generation fisherman, and he was at the time of this the chief of the Sami Fishermen's Association. So there were about 150 fishermen that he oversaw, and so I had been trying to find him for some time, because I really realized that this was a real leader. And finally, against his better judgment, he decided that he would agree to be interviewed. And what happened was the most delightful conversation that I have one of them. I mean, I have many. But, so I wanted to share with you what, in fact, Willy Olsen had to say about being a leader. So I was asking him just about his work and how he did things, and how, what does it mean to be the chief of this association? And so he says, well, that basically he does work as a fisherman. He works alone usually, except with his son in the high season. But he said, what we do is we work together. And he says, and what I can do is I can help everybody make their own quota of fish. So he says when he hits a hot spot, he calls everybody on the radio to tell them where the fish are, so that everybody can get there and everybody can get their own share. And he says, so we talk to each other all day long about news, about what's going on, about who's got fish on the radio. And we've always done this way. We help each other. Why not? And then when I asked him about his work as, sort of his administrative work as the chief of this association, he says he was very modest. And he said, well, my job is mostly to resolve issues involving the fishermen in the organization. So in my job, I sit down and I talk with them about the problems. I listen to what they have to say, and we try to find ways to work things out together. And I was so touched by that. I mean, it sounds very simple, but in my work as a leadership consultant in the West, collaboration, what? I mean, it was always about competition. Who could have the most fish? What did it mean to be the boss? How could the boss, doesn't the boss have privileges? Don't they get the best parking spot? Don't they begin to have the corner office and all these things that indicate that I'm special and I'm different? For him, it was about equality. It was about helping other people and being who he was. And if it was about problems, it was about listening and sitting down and talking about it. And so that's, and at first I thought, well, he must be an anomaly. There really couldn't be too many people that really do that. So I went on. And so here's another example. And so I would like to introduce you to Elbior Valjord, a high school principal in Sortland, Vesterålen. Now, Elbior is also a fifth generation Sami living in these islands. She says that they don't really know when they got there because they've been there forever. And so, as I was doing with all the people there, I was asking them, so what does it mean to be a principal? How do you actually work as a principal in this culture? And so I wanted to share with you Elbior's story because it was a very important way of understanding Willie Olsen's story, actually. So she had spent a long time talking to me about how she was raised. And she said that her father raised her and that he never, ever punished her. That when there was something that she did wrong, something that she didn't know about, that he would sit down with her and tell her what was wrong and what needed to be different next time. But that he never actually beat her or yelled at her or did anything that she would construe as punishment. So here's what she says about being a principal. She says, well, I mentioned earlier that my father never punished me. And now, as a school principal, I can talk in a similar way with my teachers and my pupils. I shall tell you a story about that. Everybody wanted to tell me a story about that, because life is a story. And she said, last week I met with one of my teachers. She was a good teacher, but she had very many problems. And they kept her from being a good teacher with the children. And so one day I asked her in, and we talked about that. And finally she came to her own decision and stepped down. And she was very grateful that we could talk about it and come to the right decision for her and for the children. We didn't have to yell, and I didn't have to tell her that she was a bad teacher. And perhaps in a year or so, when her problems are resolved, she can come again and be a teacher for us. It was a good outcome for everyone. And so I was so struck by the fact of how she did it. So she didn't have to yell, it wasn't about punishment and it wasn't about blame. But what it was about was saying what was so. It was about telling the truth. But telling the truth without blame and without judgment. And then what she finally did, I asked her about this later, and I said, well, so how did she decide to step down? She said, well, I said, so what shall we do about this? And what would you like to do about this? And she finally said, well, I shouldn't be here right now. And so I sort of fast forwarded to my corporate job and all the corporate people that I used to work with to say, well, all right, how would that have gone there? And so you know exactly how it would have gone. Well, you've done this, you've done this, you've done this, you've done this, and so we're really going to have to let you go now. Boom, and please sign this contract for, for whatever, for mediation and non-conflict. So I began to see that this wasn't something that was unique to just one or two people, but this was actually the whole way in action that they understand how to live. So I'd like to show you one more example. So we've been talking so far about leaders in particular organizations, but I'd like to introduce you to Øystein Hansen. And he is what I would absolutely call a cultural leader. And Øystein's story was really quite remarkable. He grew up believing he was Norwegian. And he'd never had any idea that he was Sami at all. His family, his father, and his family had always believed they were simply Norwegian. But Øystein had always had dreams. And he'd had dreams that of speaking a different language and of playing flutes that were always made with natural materials. And he could never account for any of this until one night he had a dream where he saw himself on a hill, and there were two turf huts, the earth huts, that he knew were where it was in the dream was where he was living. And then he saw a stream, and then he saw finally some reindeer that were running past these turf huts. And he realized in the dream that he was a Sami man. So when he woke up, he realized that he actually remembered that place, that it was a real place. And so he drove to the hill where he had seen this in the dream. And there were the remnants of the turf huts, there was a stream, there was everything that he had seen in the dream. And then he thought, there's something going on here. I think I'm Sami. I think our family is Sami. And so he drove to his grandfather's house, and he confronted him. And his grandfather broke down, and he said, well, yes, it is true. And what happened in the Norwegianization program that the government had been doing for almost 100 years, that went on until 1960, the only way you could own property was if you were a Norwegian. And if you were Sami, the only way you could get property was to declare yourself a Norwegian. And forever after, put your culture aside. And so he said, well, I did it for the kids. I did it for the family. We wanted to have something to call our own. And so from that moment forward, never again was there any mention of, I believe, in Sami. And so, and by the way, that's not an unusual story. I've talked to many people up there who had similar stories about the secret. It was always called the secret. And the secret was that someone was Sami, but it was too shameful to be Sami because you were less than if you were Sami. So this is how Øystein decided to deal with it. And he says, so when I became aware, when I understood who I am, I saw that some of my family didn't like it, and people around me didn't understand. It couldn't be true. We were Norwegians. Finito. So the music, so his music with the flute playing, and then concerts ultimately. Music has been a language for me to tell the truth. It has been the most important language for me. And when I play music from that stage, I've told audiences what's behind the melodies that I make and what's behind the melodies that I've learned. And that was accepted. And then it was accepted by my family. So I had been asked quite early if I would come along and fight for the Sami, and fight for the Sami people. And I have always thought, I will not fight with guns. I will fight with the software of life. So I've used music. And then I could take my Sami clothes and use them. And Sami clothes are, of course, their own traditional garb. And then it was accepted. And as time passed, more and more of my family accept our Sami background. They stand up today and say, we are Sami. And for me, that's so great. And today, people in the neighborhood and in the community are proud of what I've done. And they're proud, for they get a possibility to come along with me. And in some ways, it's like I'm the conductor on the locomotive of the train, and they can be passengers, be together on the same train. So music has been very, very important to me, to tell my story and to tell the truth. Well, I have to tell you, that one brought me to full stop. And I had to stop and think about my own life, you know. Where have I chosen to stand up for who I am? And where have I chosen to hide behind the veneer of conventional life? And I have to say, I have been hiding. And all of a sudden, it became so important to me to understand really who I was and to stand up and be that person. And it's a quite different person inside than perhaps I ever presented to the corporate board of directors in any leadership group I was ever in, or maybe even in the university, because I didn't know if it would be accepted. And so I finally, that was yet one more of those transformational moments where, my God, I have to be different. And they are showing me how. If they can do it, as you know, as marginalized as they are in the Norwegian society, if they can do it, well, I have to be able to show up for my own life. So, thank you, Øystein Hansen, for that. Now, I just want to say a couple more things briefly and to conclude. Okay? So, interconnectedness. When we come back to interconnectedness, we are looking at interconnectedness also with nature, you know, not just being interconnected with each other, but also with the natural world. And of course, I was very interested in that because that was part of the PhD. And so I wanted to talk to people who had somehow had sustainable kinds of work. And so I wanted to introduce you to Roar Nayan. And he is a reindeer herder. These are, by the way, his Sami clothes. That's what it means to be in your Sami clothes. He chose to wear these clothes into a restaurant that was filled with Norwegians in gray suits. And he did so ever so proudly. And it was like, yes! And so I just asked him about his life. What was it like to be a reindeer herder? He says, well, you know, I haven't always been a reindeer herder. For the first 10 years of my life, I worked in a plastics factory. And I said, a plastics factory? He said, yeah. He said, I would work 3 shifts. 1 week I would work from 7 to 4. The next week I would work from 4 to midnight. And then the 3rd week I would work from midnight to 7. And he said, and so I did that for 10 years and I never had a life. And it was only about trying to pay the bills. And then one day I started talking to my wife about the fact that I felt like I was losing my soul. And she said, well, we have to do something else. And so he chose to take the meager savings that they had and to buy a few good reindeer. And he's never looked back. So I want to share with you just how he thinks about his life now. And so when I was interviewing him, I was asking him about reindeer herding, because I didn't know anything about reindeer herding. And I said, so, one of the questions I asked him was, well, how do you find all your reindeer? If it's mountainous, there's valleys, and they roam. And he says, oh, yes. He says, well, that's a really good question. A lot of people ask me that. Well, I have a GPS system. And so I have all my reindeer marked, and I take my laptop, and then I can find them all. It's like, Oh my God. So I thought I was getting the gist of this whole thing. It's like, oh, so you know how many you have, you know where they are, it's probably good for profitability and efficiency. And then he started to scowl. And he said, no, it's not like that at all. And he said, so here he says, no, that is not good. If you start counting your reindeer, you just start to count a lot of money. Then it stops being fun. And it's like, does not compute, don't know. And I said, all right, so tell me about this. And tell me, and I was just flabbergasted that what I thought was a simple occupation was turning out to be anything but simple. I said, all right, so tell me what makes it fun. I'm not sure I understand. And he says, well, a lot of people don't understand. It is hard working with reindeer. You get so little money, and you have to have money to survive. But for me, I'm never thinking about money. When I was young, I thought about some things I should do before I die. And that was to get myself a wife, children, a house, and a car. Now I have everything. Money don't make me happy. My wife makes me happy. My children make me happy. A lot of people, they don't understand it. They want more and more money. But I'm thinking more about my wife than about my money and buying stuff. I have a perfect life. And so, another one of those moments of full stop, when I was thinking about what happens here, where success is measured in wealth and in possessions and in status, and we have our crazy consumer, lifestyle that is about buying everything. And then it occurred to me that, maybe what we're doing is trying to buy happiness rather than finding it from within. Because for him, happiness is success. And that was another one of those life-changing moments. And then another brief comment about Nils. Nils became my companion. He was, everyone that I met in Samiland was completely, I would say, sort of freaked out because he was a Noidi. He was one of those people who could see things. Well, I thought he was absolutely delightful. And he wanted somebody to hang out with, and I wanted somebody to hang out with. So for about 5 days, we hung out together. And what I began to understand about Nils is that it's an avocation to be a Noidi. But what is really true is that he was an expert hunter, fisher, and naturalist. And because he spent his time out on the land, he knew all the habits of every creature that he was trying to find. And so when I first started to talk to him, he said, well, why are you here? That was whatever they wanted. Why are you here? I said, well, I'm doing a PhD research on leaders in terms of environmental sustainability. He's like, finally! And he spent the next hour telling me the most detailed information about what was happening on the planet. From, the global problems with the ocean, the swirling mass in the Pacific, CO2, the problem with pollution in cars and intoxicants, and all of these. I mean, it was remarkable. And I gave him a little gift, because I thought I should give an idea a gift. And so I gave him a little clamshell with some sage that he, so he could burn some sage, which he wasn't real sure about that. That was a pagan practice. But the first thing he did was look at the shell, and he said, where did you get this? And I said, well, in California. And he says, well, where in California? Because do you know about this shell? And I knew that clam shells did not grow up there. And so I said, no, but you don't. Do you know about this shell? And he says, well, let me tell you what I see about this shell. And he says, now look at these whorls. There's all these lines that go across. Well, this clam started out as healthy, and you can see that there's a lot of space between this ridge and the next ridge, and then you see that these are starting to get closer and closer together. He said, that's pollution. He said, this clam grew in polluted water. Well, where did you get it? I got it at a store. But what and I said, well, Well, I don't know exactly, but I do know that we farm, the clams are sometimes farmed. And he said, yes, polluted water, that's the problem. And then he went on to talk about calcification and all these other things. So I really understood that he knew, completely self-taught that he knew. And then I said, well, it seems like you know a lot about wildlife. And he says, well, yeah, I do. And so I wanted to read to you just one little paragraph about how he saw things. So after he'd given me this giant lecture on sustainability, he stopped talking and he went over and there was a bush on the other side of his driveway. He shook the bush and this little bird flew out. And he says, you see, knowing about where to look for nature is about knowing habits. Mm-hmm. You see, it's cold today. And so this bird wants to stay protected. So it's underneath trying to stay warm. Birds are like people. They like to come out in the open when there's sun so that they can fluff their feathers and feel the sun. But when it's cold, they like to be completely covered in the bush because it keeps them warm and dry and they find food there. So you just have to know how the weather is going to affect anything you're looking for. And it was another one of those moments, and I thought, oh my God, how many of us here in this world, in this modern society, would know things like that? Why don't we know? We don't know because we're never out there. And then I thought, well, why is it that he has such great respect for the natural world? And it's because he knows the natural world. And why is it that we don't? Because we simply don't know. And we're never there, and we're not paying attention. And would it be different if somehow we did know more about all of the natural world? Would we change anything that we do? And I think maybe we would. So, the very last thing I want to talk briefly about is the unseen world. So, spirituality is a big topic in Sami land, and it is a place where that's very different from how we in the Western world conceptualize things. So, here in this culture, we have, I think, typically two boxes for things. So there is the real world, which is here, and then there's the spiritual world, which is somewhere else, somewhere. But, and we call that non-ordinary reality. Well, I was talking to Elina, Helena Rembrandt, and the very first time we met, we started talking about dreams and spirituality, and so I sort of caught myself and I said, oh, isn't this amazing how fast we've entered non-ordinary reality? And she just looked like I'd slapped her. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, what? And then she said, let me just get the words right. She said, well, what's so non-ordinary about spirituality or dreams? It's all part of the same continuum of reality, isn't it? There's no separation. They're just all different aspects of life. And I really had to think about that. And so what I finally understood about the way Sami spirituality works is that it is a continuum, and I could imagine it to be sort of like light. You have the spectrum of light that's visible, and we can see that, and we know it, and we can access it with our eyes. But we also have infrared and ultraviolet, which we know to exist, but we can't see them. And so it's very like the seen and the unseen world, in that they're all there, and that they believe that one supports the other. And that the unseen world is the place of synchronicities, it's the place of dreams, it's the place of intuition, it's the place of the ancestors. And that support for the visible world, for the seen world, is supplied by those invisible, unseen parts of life. And that it's very real. And so to close this whole thing, I wanted to just read one passage. The very last person that I met before I left was a woman by the name of Esther Utsi. Esther Utsi had a guest farm. What she had done through dreams was she had come up with an entire property that was filled with turf huts, these little green mounds that when you look at them have a little stovepipe and a plank door. It looked for all the world to me like the Shire in the Tolkien books, and I was just enchanted. But this particular version of turf huts were 21st century turf huts. And so when you walked into them, they had birch paneling, they had beautiful floors, they had feather beds, full full kitchens, bathrooms. It's like, I want to stay here immediately. And so I asked her how all of this had come to be. And she said, well, the term that my grandmother would use is a la Moorish. And I said, okay, tell me about a la Moorish. And she said, it means really don't worry. That if you're on your path and you're doing what you need to be doing, you will be guided and you will be supported. So don't worry. And that was a term that her grandmother had used to actually rebuild her whole town after the Germans had set fire to it all. And when she thought she might buy this property, she went into one of her bedrooms and she heard her grandmother's voice say, "A la Moorish." And she knew then that she should buy the property and it would all be good. So here's what she has to say about all that. She says, today I continue to run this farm by a la Moorish, and my business is going through the roof, all from very unlikely sources. So she smiled, and then she says, it's not good to focus on money. It's more important to focus on the vision, to look outward, to look upward, beyond, to see what wants to be created and what is needed, and then to go and do it. This is something you offer from the inside, not the outside. This is, it comes from your own internal self, not from the bottom line. So I offer that to you, to us, to all of us, as a way of understanding that perhaps we are guided, perhaps we are supported. I personally very much wanted to believe, and really came to believe, that my entire journey that led to this book was an act of guidance, and I think probably by my great-grandmother. So I thank Carolyn Johansson for all that has resulted from her. So to close this whole talk, we started with the question, what can ancient wisdom teach modern leaders? And so here I think are some of my answers to that question. And the first one is, we are all interconnected and interdependent. If we believe that, it changes things immediately. That tolerance, respect, and understanding are the harmonies of coexistence. Authenticity and integrity are foundations of trust. And that honesty means telling the truth without blame or judgment. Wise solutions come from working together. And that happiness is the best measure of success. That intuition, dreams, and synchronicities are gifts from the unseen world. And that finally we must care for our Earth Mother, because it is the source of all life. So I thank you. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your involvement. Now, if anybody would like to get a book signed, I think it's time. So, thank you all.
Any questions?
Yes, questions? Yes, for sure, Debbie.
Which chapter was the most challenging chapter for you to write in your book?
Wow, that's a good question. I do know what it is. When I was, so the dissertation actually was the story of the journey itself. The part that finished the book were the ends, both ends. And so when I was trying to understand for myself what it was that made me have to go there, have to do this, I began to have this, and by the way, to write that piece of the book, I actually went back to Norway, and I was sitting in the cabin that I was in for a portion of that journey. And so I had to get back in touch with that person. And I realized that, it wasn't just about going to visit another culture, it was about going to find myself in that culture. And I didn't know really what that meant. And so there is one chapter in here where I'm actually trying to process that, which was the chapter I wrote in that cabin. And I spent all night writing it, and then I finally understood something more.
So Marilyn, you talked about the shaman figure,
Yes.
Noidi?
A Noidi, yes.
Noidi, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Now, I was wondering, is that something inborn? Is a person born a Noidi? Or is there training for it? And
No.
what's the social place of the Noidi?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, first of all, it is generational. Nils talked about his own family, and he said for generations they had been Noidis, but then when Norwegianization happened and they started persecuting Noidis, not only they were burning drums, this was the church, burning drums, but also burning Noidis. Then people said, oops, too dangerous. Nope, I'm not a Noidi. And so his grandfather was the last functioning Noidi. His father stepped out altogether and said he wasn't going to do it. And then all kinds of bad things began to happen to the family. Lots of sickness and people died. And Nils understood it as the fact that they weren't on their path. And so he decided to do that, and that he had to sort of save the family. And it was not a training, it's a gift. I mean, he's quite the person. After I left him in Cartagena, we had spent 5 days with him hanging out, and everybody was giving me the fisheye because, oh my gosh, I'm hanging out with that person? And then I went to visit Elina, and I said, so I just spent some time with Nils Helman. Do you know him? And we were eating dinner, and her fork just stopped in midair, and she said, who? And I said, him. And she goes, oh, I know him. And then she said, let me tell you about Nils Helman. She said, he came to visit me about a year ago for some other reason. And so we were having lunch in this, the only restaurant in Utaki. And she said, so I live here and I know all the people. It was a busy day and the tables were crowded. And she said, and I knew all of these people. And he walked in and he sat down and he says, I know what's going on with everyone in the room. And she thought he was just, blowing smoke. And she said, okay, tell me. So he said, well, this table over here, there's a doctor here, but he's not well, and his wife wants to leave him. And she knew that couple, and she knew that was exactly true. And there were 10 other tables, and he went around the room, and he told everything that was going on, every single person. And Elena didn't know what to think about that. That's what scares people, is that he just knows too much. So it is a gift. And in his employment, he's often employed to find things. And so finding reindeer is one of his big daily, like everybody else would, that'd be their daily existence. So it's like, oh, you want another reindeer? Okay. Well, and so he just knows. Yeah.
I'm curious how you're weaving.
By the way, I have to say that Shoshana is the spiritual grandmother of this entire book. She that let me write it as a story to begin with. And so you see, it pays benefits. Yes?
I was wondering how you're weaving what you've taken from all this into your professional life.
Chapter 10. It's been big, and it isn't done. It's mostly about how to remember what's really important, because this culture is so different. And I spent a really long time when I came back feeling like a fish out of water. It's been hard, actually. But it also is important, I think, to try to show up in a good way. I hope I do that. I'm sure I don't always do that, but it's practice. All right, are we ready for book signings? Okay, so if you have a book or you want to buy a book, meet me at the table.